Good evening. Welcome again to another fantastic Faena Rose event. We're incredibly honored and happy to have Laurie Woolever, who has, I think, or had what I think is one of the coolest titles. She is a writer and author, and she's also, for many, many years, she was the lieutenant to the late Anthony Bourdain. And we're here to talk about one of the two books that she's written this year, the one in particular called Bourdain, the Definitive Oral Biography. So Laurie, welcome. Tell us a little bit what to expect on this conversation we're gonna have.
Well, Tony was a complicated guy, and we're gonna take a look at some of the more interesting aspects of his life, some of the stories that you haven't heard. He was a storyteller, but now his friends and family get to tell the stories about him.
Fantastic. And you share some of the photos as well, some personal photos with us. So we're incredibly excited to honor and think back of the incredible human being that Tony Bourdain, Anthony Bourdain was, and we're excited to have Laurie with us tonight. So can't wait. But let's talk about tonight. Tonight, I actually want to thank one of our Rose members who's not here tonight because he's out of town, but our good friend Lee Schrager, who we all know from South Beach Wine and Food Festival, as well as New York Wine and Food Festival. Lee Schrager is one of our founding members. He helps us out a lot with our programming, and Lee had this idea to bring in Laurie. I said, absolutely, right away, please introduce me, and so here we are. So, we have books for you. We have books for you on the way out or during cocktails. Laurie has already signed them, but she's more than happy to personalize them. So they're in the back there. But first, a little bit about our esteemed guests. Allow me to say a couple of words about her. So Laurie Woolever is a writer, editor, and for nearly a decade, she worked as the lieutenant to the late author, TV host, and producer, Anthony Bourdain. I love that title, lieutenant. Wow, sounds love it. She has written for New York Times, Vogue, GQ, Food and Wine, Lucky Peach, Saveur, Bloomberg, Dissent, Roads and Kingdoms, and many, many other. In 1999, Laurie earned her bachelor's degree at Cornell University, after which she moved to New York and completed the professional training program at the French Culinary Institute. She's been many things, including a private chef, a nanny, a caterer, a writer, a busgirl, a recipe tester, a farmhand, a public speaker, video store clerk. Was that Blockbuster? No, was it? Independent, okay, even better. And an editor at the Art Culinaire and Wine Spectator. She's published several books, including in 2016, she published Appetites, a cookbook, which was co-authored with Anthony Bourdain. This year alone, she has two books out on Anthony Bourdain. In April 2021, her second collaboration with Anthony is called World Travel, an Irreverent Guide, and they entered the New York Times bestseller list at #1. And in September of 2021, her third book on Bourdain, called Bourdain, the Definitive Oral Biography, debuted on the New York Times bestseller list at #7. She's the co-host of a food-focused podcast, Carb Face for Radio, with the affable shit-stirrer Chris Thornton. I didn't write this. She did. And Laurie lives and works in New York City with her 13-year-old son, correct? Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Laurie Woolever. Please.
Hello.
Welcome, Laurie.
Wow.
So, by the way, as always, we want this to be just a casual conversation amongst friends. We will absolutely provide an opportunity to have you ask questions, get them ready, feel free, don't be shy. But Laurie, welcome. I want to start. So Cornell University.
That's
Where did
right.
you grow up?
Yes. I grew up in upstate New York, outside of Syracuse, which is a great place to grow up and a great place to move away from as quickly as possible.
When did you know you were going to leave?
Probably about the age of 10, maybe. I thought,
Wow.
I think I've done everything I can here. I got to make some
By
moves.
10, that's great. And did you always know you'd end up in New York City?
Probably, yeah. You know, it's in New York State where I grew up, but New York City couldn't have been farther away, and it really felt like the natural kind of place to tumble downhill to, and you know, I just wanted to be able to move around freely, and you know, and I still feel this way. The sort of endlessly renewing possibilities, and always new people, always new opportunities. There's just nothing like it for me, and certainly where I grew up, it was cows and tractors. So it's been my home for 25 years.
And what were your interests growing up?
Writing, primarily.
Okay.
You know, I was always kind of writing my own story in my head and writing little things down, writing plays. I was interested in cooking, you know, not particularly well, but with a lot of enthusiasm. And, you know, school. I was kind of a school nerd. I was good at it, and I enjoyed it. I really liked praise, and
Okay.
so it was a good combination of factors.
And right after school, you moved to New York. Did you go to the French Culinary Institute right away, or did you?
No, I had 2 years. I got hired by a family that wanted a private cook who had no experience, which is pretty unusual. They were, this was the late 90s, so it was all, you know, Snackwells and fat-free everything, and they just wanted someone to cook in the very plain fat-free style that they wanted. They had actually hired a classically trained French chef at first, and they had to fire her because she could not put butter in the food, you know. She just refused to cook in this very bland, sort of healthy way. And I was like, well, happily, you know, steam your vegetables and boil your spaghetti, so.
And from there, so you're a cook, a personal
Yep.
cook, personal chef. From there, your first foray into the high-profile culinary world was with?
I was Mario Batali's assistant for 3.5 years at a very kind of formative time for him. He had just opened up Babbo about 6 months before that, which was, you know, for a long time the
Absolutely.
toughest room, toughest door in New York, and he was just kind of coming up as a television personality. So I had this amazing opportunity. To be honest, I think I was the only person who applied for the job, which seems crazy now, but he wasn't that well known. He was just kind of a small-time cable figure. The restaurants were just getting started, and all of my classmates in cooking school went to cooking school to learn how to cook and then to be restaurant cooks. For me, I just thought, I don't have the stomach for this. You know, it's a fun job, it's an amazing job, but it's really, really hard. And I just thought, if there's another way, if I can somehow use this education but not have to, you know, be on my feet 14 hours a day, sweating and making, I think the going rate was about $8 an hour back then. So, and I didn't make that much more working for Mario, but it was a lot more fun.
Right.
And it was like this amazing graduate education in all things restaurants, food, wine, real estate, business, you know, media. It was extraordinary. I mean, you know, we all know things have not been great for Mario in the past couple of years by his own actions. Yes. But at the time, it was a pretty great job.
And from there, what was next after working for him, for Mario Batali for 3.5 years? What came next?
So he introduced me to Tony Bourdain, and we had this conversation today where you said, I don't want to call him Tony because I didn't know him.
I don't want to call him Tony. I didn't know him. I'm going to call him Anthony.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. Maybe by the end you'll feel like you know him. I mean, anyway, you're going to hear me calling him Tony because that's what he called himself. So Mario introduced me to Tony, who was just about to write his first cookbook and was looking for someone to to edit and test recipes, to take the recipes from the kitchen, which were, you know, scrawled on scraps of paper and covered with grease and, you know, made, enormous quantities and to sort of scale them down and make them cookbook
I mean, they're
level.
not kept on beautifully leather-bound notebooks and beautiful calligraphy?
No,
Okay.
not at all. I think most of the time they're kept like in cooks' heads, but they do have this, this kitchen Bible.
How hard is it to do that? How hard is it to pare down these recipes into something that anyone can?
You learn the tricks, you learn the skills. I would not say it's, rocket science is the cliche, but it's, you have to sort of understand not everything is scaled up or scaled down at the same rate, and there are some things you can leave as is, and some things that happen in restaurants that you just don't need to do at home. Cooking French fries at home was a particularly messy and unrewarding experience, but.
So with Anthony Bourdain, working for him, what was that like? And so at this point, you're testing out recipes for him for his first cookbook, Les Halles, right? And what year was that?
That was 2002. It was great to work with him. He was, there we are. He was very different from, I had read Kitchen Confidential, everyone had read Kitchen Confidential. I was expecting him to be like a pirate, with 2 cigarettes in each hand and drunk and brash and mean, and he was nothing like that. He was really gentle and a little bit shy and socially awkward and very professional and very kind and unfailingly generous throughout the whole process, and really throughout the whole time that I knew him.
Wow. And how long was that just a single project, or was that?
So that was a one-off, and from there I did a number of things. I worked as a freelance writer. You listed off some of my my jobs out of order, but I did freelance writing. I did catering, cooking, private cooking, and then eventually I went to work at Art Culinaire, which is sort of a small circulation, sort of a chef porn kind of quarterly. Full color, beautiful big photos, close-ups of food. I did that for 2 years, and then I went to Wine Spectator for a number of years. So I had, a good education in the magazine world.
Yeah. So going from that project for Anthony Bourdain to going to do these different freelances and a couple different publishing, how did you circle back around with Anthony Bourdain? For the lieutenant role.
Yeah. So I had a baby, which, just changes your life in a million different ways. And I just didn't, I thought, let me figure out a way to not have to be, commuting into Manhattan from Queens every day, pumping in the office and, not getting any sleep. And I wanted to transition out of that into something a little more flexible. And so I reached out to Tony and a number of other people and just said, I need a part-time job. I will alphabetize your pretzels. I will do, whatever, anything. I don't want to work in an office anymore. And his assistant happened to be on her way out, and he said, would you like to be my assistant? I know maybe you've aged out of that, and maybe you've got more experience than the typical assistant, but I know you, I trust you, what do you think? And I mean, he barely had to finish the sentence, and I said yes. It just seemed like a dream job, because it was Tony.
What were the best parts of the job?
He was very, very generous. Again, I mean, not only financially, but he was really generous with access and with opportunity. And I think he was very grateful and very sort of surprised always at his own kind of overnight success. And he was really willing, if he saw that somebody had an interest or had an ability, he was very willing to try and help them along and use whatever access and platform that he had to help somebody else rise up. So for me, it meant that I started line editing books on his publishing imprint, and then got the opportunity to write the cookbook with him, Appetites, that we published in 2016. So that to me was one of the best parts of the job, was that knowing that it wasn't just making someone's reservations and travel arrangements and doctor appointments, which I did happily, but it was getting to be occasional collaborators and him generously introducing me to people and helping me get a leg up in a very competitive industry.
Anthony Bourdain, I love his Twitter handle or his Twitter bio. Instead of having all this, it just said enthusiast, right? And And I think that perfectly captures him, but also I think it could have quite as easily said passionate,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Or, and it seemed like he was passionate, maybe to a fault, about many things.
Sure.
Drugs, heroin, crack, we don't have to name them, but, writing, right? He's very open about all this. Writing, cooking, obviously, jujitsu.
Yep.
Love.
Yeah.
And tanning.
Tanning, yes, yeah. He had a particular obsession with tanning, especially in the 80s. And in the book, you'll see a number of his colleagues from kitchens in the 80s talk about his obsession with tanning and a very competitive approach to tanning of all things. I mean, there was a summer where they were basically having a tanning contest. And later in his life, his first wife, Nancy, spoke with me for the book and said, I knew that things maybe weren't going so well for him because he had let his tan go. So this was sort of the canary in the coal mine in a way. So
that was awfully telling. So let's talk a little bit about the book, the Definitive Oral Biography. So this is a little bit of a different type of biography. I think the way you approached it is not your traditional, straightforward biographical route. Talk a little bit about the process and what made you decide to interview 100 different friends, colleagues, business contacts, so on and so forth. What made you choose that route?
So this book came about very quickly after Tony's death. I'd say within less than a month. A lot of us were in kind of constant contact with each other in those early days, just sort of boosting each other up, making sure we were okay, kind of talking things out. And I was talking a lot to his editor, Daniel Halpern at Echo, and his agent, Kimberly Witherspoon, who's now my agent, about what projects we had in the works, what would become of his literary legacy. And I was already working on world travel. We had started working on that together when he died. And this idea came up. A lot of people also started coming out of the woodwork right away, looking to, for lack of a better word, looking to capitalize on his death, looking to be the first person to put in a bid to make a documentary or to write a biography or to write a tell-all or whatever it was. And we wanted to, for obvious reasons, we wanted to be the ones to tell that story, at least tell it first. Coming from a place of knowing, coming from a place of empathy and understanding. So Dan floated the idea of the oral biography as an alternative to a traditional biography, which is a really interesting, very obviously well-respected and useful literary form, but something that takes a lot of time. 5 to 10 years of really, really painstaking and intensive research that, frankly, we wanted to get to the marketplace first. Right. And none of us really saw a way that kind of book would serve the immediate sort of pain and the questions around such a sort of a shocking death. For me personally, I found this format to be hugely cathartic. It was a very lonely time, to have Tony die, to have my kind of professional world fall apart, and myself and my friends and colleagues, obviously hugely affected by this loss. To have the opportunity in a productive way to sit down with all of these people who knew and loved Tony, to get their stories, to get, to look at photos I'd never seen before, to meet people that were part of his life that I had never had a chance to meet because they were from, decades ago. To have the opportunity to speak with his first wife, Nancy, who was notoriously private and very, very hard nut to crack, and she was willing to talk to me and tell me stories about, she knew Tony since he was a 13-year-old, so she had a perspective that no one else had. So it just made sense to do it in this way versus a biography, which I'm sure someone will do a deeply researched biography at some point, but this felt more personal and immediate and just really let people tell their stories directly, the way that Tony would invite people to tell their own stories when he traveled for television.
And I think an important note is you had mentioned that others trying to capitalize on the opportunity in the story, but this book, your book, has the blessing of the estate, correct?
That's right.
And portions of the book go to the estate, which goes towards his daughter.
His daughter,
correct?
Yeah.
So I think that's a beautiful part of this. Going back to sort of, how did you start compiling the list of these dozens and dozens of people that you wanted to interview, and who was the hardest get? It sounds like Nancy, one of them.
Yeah, I would say Nancy was probably the hardest get, but she, I just kind of gently wore her down and won her trust. I think the fact that I had been Tony's assistant for so long really convinced her, and the fact that a significant chunk of the money went to Tony's daughter. I think everyone has her interests top of mind. As far as putting together the list, there were people that I had built relationships with over nearly a decade of being Tony's assistant, so they were some of the first people on the list, people that were just part of this orbit. Tony had this way of making work into family, and making whoever were his colleagues in any situation, they became really his gang. He always was about having a team or a gang, whether it was in the kitchen or in the field making television or in the process of publishing a book. He really he was a leader of men. He really was the definition of a chef, which is not someone who is brilliant with food, although they can be, but it really is someone who leads a team or leads a crew. And it was, I think, very comfortable to him to always keep that format around no matter what he was doing professionally. So there was a crew, and then there was, circles rotating out from there.
Who were your top 2 favorite interviews?
Oh, there's so many.
And why?
Okay. Top of mind is Anderson Cooper, who was, I think, the very last interview that I did. He was just an extraordinarily busy person, obviously, and it was just tough to get him. I think also I was, so many people were so moved by Tony's death, and you never really know friendship between 2 very high-profile people. How real is it? How, or how much of it is just for show, or is it just like, I see you, I'm famous, you're famous, and we've experienced the same things. Anderson we truly admired and respected Tony, and had some beautiful things to say. Anderson unfortunately lost his own brother to suicide when he was 21, so he had some really beautiful insights and some painful observations about what it is and the impact that it can have on you to live on the road, to live in that way where you're in different countries every week of the year, and it's hard to sometimes maintain those really essential connections with people that define your life when you're not working. So that was a really important interview for me for this book. And Tony's daughter, I spoke with her. I think she's 14 now. I spoke with her when she was 12. And she's a really articulate, smart, brilliant kid. He loved her so much and would talk about her. To the point sometimes where it'd be like, all right, enough about your kid, But he was a great dad, and she's a super smart kid. So she didn't have a ton to say, but what she did say was poignant and sweet and smart and sort of wise beyond her years. So she gets the last quote in the book.
Who were the 2 people you couldn't get that you wish you could have gotten?
Let's see. Well, there were a handful of people writers that Tony really liked and admired and had in common the history of addiction. And so there were 3 of them: Jerry Stahl, Mark Maron, who of course is a writer, podcaster, comedian, actor, director, and Mary Carr, the memoirist. And they were all people that were suggested to me that I speak with, who had relationships with Tony. And all 3 of them, came from a place of, I really don't want to comment on a fellow addict when he's not around anymore. When we all believe, or when they believed, and I tend to agree with them, that being an addict was part of what led him to make the decision that he made at the end of his life. So that was disappointing, because there are people that Tony really admired and loved their writing, and writers can often make decent interviews. So, and then there was a filmmaker named Dimitri Castorine who started making a documentary film about Tony back in 2000, right when Kitchen Confidential first hit the New York Times bestseller list, and it would have been this really brilliant portrait of someone whose life just was upended by success. Dimitri never ended up finishing the film, but he shot about 100 hours with Tony, interviews, on-the-job stuff at Leal, some travel stuff, interviews with friends and family. And Dimitri's still alive, and he just said, no, I've said everything I had to say. And I really wish, he was somebody who was really closely observing Tony at this very crucial turning point in his life. The sort of silver lining of that is that he licensed all of that footage to the filmmaker that made Roadrunner,
right,
which was
Morgan.
the documentary that came out this summer. So Morgan Neville got to work with all of that footage, and you can see it sort of brilliantly cut in. You know, so he interviewed some of the same people 20 years later, and there's some really just poignant, beautiful stuff with Tony as a young, relatively young man whose life is changing.
Yeah, I think that part of Roadrunner was some of the most interesting part. For those of you who haven't seen it, it shows him, like you said, from before Kitchen Confidential coming out, and then to it coming out and the success, him on Oprah and all that, and that black and white footage where you see him going and writing, right, and his friend who was the writer that he would, all that footage was absolutely fascinating. And I wondered how they got it. I'm like, how did they? But obviously, you answered it.
Yeah, I mean, if Dimitri had finished that film, that might not have been, you know, as impactful. So
100%, for sure. Tell us a little bit about World Traveler and Irreverent Guide.
So World Travel is a book that we started writing before Tony died. We were really inspired by Atlas Obscura, which came out, I believe, in 2017. They put together basically their World Atlas with a listing from nearly every place in the world, something unusual, something spectacular. And so we wanted to take all of this experience that Tony had as, you know, a world traveler for close to 20 years and try and replicate that format. So it's a guide to the world filtered through the lens of Tony Bourdain and all of the amazing things that he saw. Here are, you know, his favorites. I think it has, I forget how many countries, there's maybe 80, between 80 and 100 countries represented. And some chapters are quite lengthy because they're places that he went back to again and again. So there's a lot about northern Spain, and there's a lot about Japan. The New York chapter is obviously huge because that's where he made his home, and he also made a lot of television there. And there are some chapters that are short and that just have, you know, a bar or a beach shack that he loved in Zanzibar. So it's full of Tony's words. I had access to all of the transcripts of all of the shows he ever made, and of course all of the writing he ever did. So it's Tony holding forth on all of these places and events.
How many countries had he visited?
He had visited, I think it was almost 100. I think he was up to like 93 different countries, and many of them, I
wonder how many cities or how many places, because if that's just the countries.
Yeah.
What a life. Speaking of his shows, talking about his shows and the different, which was his favorite that he did?
Shows that what do you mean, like
TV shows, pardon me.
Specific
not
places?
episodes,
but shows themselves.
Yeah, if we talk about everything from A Cook's Tour to No Reservations to, you know, Parts Unknown, I feel like, you know, the two Parts Unknowns and No Reservations really kind of at first may have started off similar, but then evolved more into kind of local culture and a little bit of politics and right?
I think, you know, I don't think one could exist without the other, right? It was all kind of an evolution. Cook's Tour being, you know, a man in his mid-40s whose life has just changed, who really hasn't seen the world at all. I mean, when he started making travel television, he had been to Japan once for work and the Caribbean a handful of times. He really hadn't seen much of the United States. And then he went to France a few times as a child. So you really, with the Cook's Tour, you see this wide-eyed, sort of awkward, shy guy, and then No Reservations, he starts to come into his own a little more. He starts to become a filmmaker in his own right. And then Parts Unknown, it was sort of the full expression, he had full creative control and was starting to return to places. And it started to become, in a way, less about food or less about food for food's sake and more about using food as a key to start understanding cultures and start understanding what people's lives were truly like. I skipped the layover because he hated that. He absolutely hated making the layover. And you can see it. I mean, it makes for hilarious and you know, really effective television because he's as cranky as you would be if you were flying from, you know, New York to Hong Kong and having to eat, you know, 7 meals in a day and then get on a plane and go to Singapore and then do it again in Bangkok. And, you know, it really was, it was punishing, you know, and he managed to make it very, very funny. But it was, rough. You know, he typically would have his summers off, and then the layover they shot in the summertime. So he kind of gave up his summer vacation. I mean, you know, a little bit. It's like, well, boo-hoo, you know.
Sure.
But it's hard on the body and it's hard on the mind, you know, to travel
Absolutely.
that much.
What would you say are his 3 favorite episodes?
I mean, I would just be speculating. You know, I think it was really meaningful to him to successfully sit down with President Obama in 2016 in Hanoi, Vietnam. That was something that was very many months in the making. And I think he was really proud of having sort of engineered it in a way that didn't feel, that he felt okay about. You know, my understanding is that the ask came from the White House, and they wanted Tony to interview Obama on Air Force One. And he was like, I don't want to be a captive guest on the president's plane. You know, that really sort of tilts the playing field in a way that I'm not comfortable with. If he wants to meet with me, he can meet with me on my turf, you know, which is like fairly ballsy, you know,
yeah. Totally.
And it panned out, you know, and up until the last minute, it was not clear that it was going to pan out because, of course, you know, it's literally the president of the United States, and there's always...
It's only the president of the United States, I mean.
But it did, and it was perfect. It was a very humble restaurant. They had bun cha. You know, it was a meal that probably all in was about $7 with 2 beers and 2 bowls of bun cha. They had what I think was a really relaxed and easy conversation, and it was at a really interesting, critical turning point for our country. So I think he was really proud of that.
He loved Vietnam,
He loved Vietnam.
He say it's one of his favorite countries.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, any episode where he could do it with a friend. So, you know, a number of times he took the chef Eric Ripert with him oftentimes to France, but also they went to China. So those episodes, you know, Marseille in particular, where Tony had never been, even though he had been to France any number of times at that point, but Marseille kind of gets overlooked, and it's, you know, it's the 2nd biggest city in France, and it's just so different from the rest of the country. And you could see how much fun they were having making that episode.
Eric was with them the last episode, wasn't it? The filming of the last, right?
Yep.
Episode.
So they were in Alsace, and which they had never shot in before at the time that Tony died. That's right.
And okay, do you know his least favorite aside from the layover episodes?
I know there was an episode in Romania that I think made great television. It was a No Reservations. It was a long time ago. It made for great, really funny television because everything went wrong. The fixer was kind of on the take from the government, and the government was trying to control things. There was some sort of a costume party ambush, you know, which I think was many of Tony's worst nightmares all rolled into one. So I think that was like an unpleasant experience, and yet made for great television. There was, and this is in the book too. There was an episode in Budapest where he just wasn't having a good time. And a dog jumped on him while he was waiting to go on camera. And this was a female dog that was not fixed, and she got blood all over his pants. That was unpleasant. You know, and I'm sure there were others where if he just didn't feel the energy, it was, sorry, have I?
No, that's...
you want to take a beat and recover? Sorry.
No, I was thinking of, and then another episode or apparently it's rumored that his least favorite food was pickled Icelandic shark.
Oh, fermented shark.
Fermented shark meat.
It's hakarl.
Right.
Yeah, not great. I mean, he was very game, especially I think in the beginning he was very game. He would eat anything. I think at some point he stopped wanting to be known as the guy that would eat everything, right, because that follows you, that sort of pigeonholes you. And he's still, I think to this day, people think, oh, the guy that ate the live beating cobra heart. Those are indelible images. So.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to remove that. I want to open it up for questions. Any questions? Please, Julio.
Hi.
I haven't read the book. I really don't know a lot about Anthony Bourdain, but having known him so long, what do you think characterized him that made him so popular and impactful? And now that he's gone, what do you think is his legacy?
That's a good question. So the first part, what do I think made him so powerful and impactful? I think he had this really interesting combination of, having really worked and in obscurity for 28 years as a chef. He had a certain everyman sensibility, and he had a way that people felt they knew him because he understood, you know, what it was to work hard and not have enough money and not be able to pay your bills, and to work anyway for the love of the job. You know, he had a very kind of working class sensibility. He grew up in New Jersey and New York City and just had a relatability that I think not all of the television hosts, travel hosts, or food show hosts have. So that was it. And then also he was so funny, so, you know, really, really had such a facility with language. So he could be describing something that was very, very ordinary, but in this way that just made you, you know, crack up and see it in a totally different way. And I think, you know, people respond to people that are funny and that can reflect back maybe some of the hard truths of the world in a funny way that kind of makes them feel seen. And he was very, very smart, you know. He was empathetic. I mean, he had all these wonderful qualities. And then I think also the magic little touch is that he also was a little bit awkward and shy and a little bit, you know, he never kind of relaxed into it and was like, look at me, I'm the Marlboro Man. You know, he always was a little bit breaking the fourth wall and acknowledging the weirdness of being a celebrity. And I think that also is very disarming and very makes people feel that they can relate to him more. So, and he also worked really, really hard. You know, I think there was this illusion that he could just sort of dash off a book, and but he actually worked really hard to do as well as he could with the opportunities that were given to him. As far as his legacy, well, I think I think he probably would chafe at the idea that he single-handedly changed travel or travel television, but he definitely came into it. He came into this opportunity in media in a moment where things were really changing for travel, and I think he shone a very bright spotlight on that. So I think that, you know, I had started as a food writer in the late 90s, and everything was about luxury and golf courses and caviar and champagne. It was very difficult to get a writing assignment if there wasn't some aspect of fine dining and, you know, the highest sort of expression of all of that. And I think Tony really showed people that there were other ways to travel, there were other ways to eat, that there was a lot of value in street food and even fast food or bar food or just, you know, a family-run restaurant that was never going to be in gourmet but was doing something that was really real and soulful. So I think that that's part of his legacy is expanding people's notion of what travel can and should be, and that it's, you know, it can be more accessible to everyone.
I would say not just travel, but just culture in general, right? And really kind of embracing all cultures. And he really broke down all these barriers in that regard and had people travel through a truly more diverse cultural lens than
absolutely.
the normal.
How do you make that jump from obscurity to fame? What was that? You sort of skipped that part.
Sure. So he wrote the book Kitchen Confidential in 2000, but you know there were some just very, very lucky steps leading up to that. You know, he wrote basically an extended essay about the restaurant business with no ambition to publish it widely, just really to entertain himself and his friends. He tried to get it published in two different weekly free newspapers in New York that were both competitors to the Village Voice. Both of them declined to publish it, and then his mother took the essay and used her connections at the New York Times to get it into the hands of the editor-in-chief of the New Yorker. So really, you know, if his mother hadn't sort of gotten herself into the mix, he may have always continued to just write and toil in obscurity. The New Yorker published the essay. They loved it. You know, they could see the brilliance on the page. And from there, he very quickly got the contract to write Kitchen Confidential. Now, he had already written 2 books at that point. He wrote 2 crime novels, Bone in the Throat and Gone Bamboo. And they didn't really do that well. They, you know, modest sales, kind of genre fiction. But it was that voice in Kitchen Confidential, that truth-telling, that hilarity, that willingness to turn the lens back on himself that really, really resonated with people. So it was the book, you know, that people, and he didn't have a television show, he didn't have a platform, he was just a guy who wrote a book, and the book was a huge bestseller. That catapulted him onto television. And it was, you know, and then it just built from there. So it was a fame that grew and grew and grew all the way until the end. You know, I started with him in 2009. He certainly was well known, but by the end, having made that move to CNN, that was just a whole other level of sort of international renown. So it was a lifelong project, I'd say.
Was it Food Network, Travel Channel, and then CNN? Was that?
That's right. I think with a brief stop in at Discovery,
right,
as the cable channels all kind of consolidate into one mega channel.
Questions?
It's
Cliff?
funny, if I've seen probably 80% of his TV shows, and if Pablo would have asked me the same question, what's Tony's favorite episode, I would have said Eric Ripert at Eric Ripert's father's house.
Oh, I think you mean Daniel Boulud in Leon, yeah?
Sorry, Daniel Boulud,
yes.
you're right.
Oh, you're absolutely
And
right.
He just has this constant smile and sense of happiness that I haven't seen in any other episode.
Yeah.
But my real question is from the movie Roadrunner, that to me really paints a very clear picture of him and the illnesses that he went through. How close were you, like, towards the end, and did you see that, feel that? Was that apparent towards the final year, couple of years of his life, in terms of what was going on?
Yeah, yes and no. So the question is about, how much or did I see that he was struggling?
The woman, I forget her name, but like the movie categorizes whatever her name is as kind of the catalyst for the end.
Yeah, which I think is a bit of an oversimplification. You know, Tony was, I mean, we sort of touched on this earlier in the talk, that Tony was an enthusiast. And, you know, there's just a narcissism of small differences between enthusiast and addict, right? So anything that he loved and that he was into 1,000%, you know, whether it was work or drugs or, you know, filmmaking or jujitsu. And he was a real romantic. So, you know, he had 2 marriages, neither one of them lasted, and then he found himself in a very intense, all-consuming romantic relationship at the end of his life that, you know, he was willing to make a lot of sacrifices for. I don't think it's necessarily fair to say that his girlfriend led him to this, but they had you know, by all accounts, a very intense, tumultuous, rocky relationship. And there are plenty of people who had direct experience working with her and Tony in the book who talk about, you know, what it was like to be with them on set. They made a number of shows together. I think he was putting more and more things in his life into that love basket. And I think that can be, if it's not properly balanced, I think that can be a recipe for disaster. You know, if something goes wrong, if that love basket gets tipped over, then what do you have left? You know, and I think to an extent, I think that's what happened. You know, they had some issues at the end of his life, and I think he just didn't have the structure, the emotional kind of fortitude to weather that, unfortunately. You know, it's tough to talk about. It all feels, you know, it can only be speculation at this point. But working closely with him, talking to him every day and knowing where he was and what he was doing, yeah, there was a big difference in the way that he was living his life and the way that he was spending his time in the last 2 years. He was really very much trying to make this romantic relationship be the thing that fulfilled all of his needs. And it's a hard thing to do.
Is it fair to say, from your perspective, did it seem toxic or did it just seem...
I don't think at the time I saw it as toxic. It's, you know, I got most of my information from Tony, and, you know, he would talk a lot about how very much in love he was, you know. So you want to believe that, you know, when your friend and boss says that they're happy, you want to believe that that's true. I mean, you know, if I had given it a lot of thought, yeah, you could see that it was not necessarily the greatest. But I don't think it really wasn't until after the fact that I think I had a truer perspective on how destructive, you know, romantic obsession can be.
Right. Any other questions? Just in the back there.
Did jiu-jitsu play in Anthony's life?
He was, for a period of probably 3 or 4 years, extremely involved with practicing jiu-jitsu. It was something that his wife, Otavia, was very, very involved with. His daughter had started to take lessons, and I think it was a way for him to kind of reconnect with his family when he was off the road. Even though he was, someone who was sort of naturally thin and could eat and drink a lot more than most people, even his metabolism started to catch up with him. So when he was in his mid to late 50s, he started to realize, I guess I better, for the first time in my life, do some exercise. So it was this kind of confluence of factors that got him onto the mat. And he has this story about how Ottavia bribed him with I don't know, it was a Valium or some sort of like intense painkiller if he would just take a lesson. And so that also was a factor. And right away, he just loved it. He really found the challenge, the idea of being terrible at something but getting a little bit better every day, through hard work, through repetition. It's very much like being a cook. You show up, you don't know anything, you just, you get yelled at by the chef, you get beat up, and your plates get thrown back at you, and every day you show up and you get a little bit better. So I think it was very familiar to him in that way. And he was extremely, extremely competitive. So this is, it's a very competitive sport. And I think he probably had a lot of, there he is, a lot of, rage and aggression that you can work out on the mat in a way that there are rules that everyone understands and follows, so it's safe in a way. Although he had some injuries too. He went hard, and he probably trained, more days a week than was strictly optimal for a man of his age. But for a while, it was everything. It was the defining factor, and it made it very difficult to make television. His producers talk about having to, rearrange scenes, and everything was about finding a jiu-jitsu facility for him to go and work out early in the morning. But if you could find him a place to go have a workout, he always did better work in the afternoon. So it was worth it.
There are stories about him being so passionate about the sport, where even with a serious injury, 2 weeks later he'd be out there competing.
Yeah.
Right? Where that didn't stop him.
Yeah.
Any other questions? So tell me a little bit about what else did you learn, going back to the book, the Definitive Oral Biography. What was the one or two things, and I'm not sure if I asked you this, I'm sorry if I did already, that you learned about Anthony that really surprised you, that just was like, wow, aside from the tanning, that you really just did not know about and really kind of came out from left field?
Yeah, I found that every single person I interviewed had something new to tell me that I didn't know about it. Sometimes there were just small details, and sometimes there were, big parts of his career that I had no idea about. But I think the overarching thing was that I didn't, as much as I could observe that sort of anxiety and that awkwardness and that shyness, I didn't know how much that impacted his feeling about television. He had a huge, huge amount of ambiguity about going on television at first. He really was very conflicted. He thought it was something that was, sort of a sellout, and that it was sort of goofy, and that, this is what he used to make fun of, and now he was doing it, and, was this really what he wanted to do? And I came, to be his lieutenant several years into the television endeavor. So he was very well established at that point. It was clear that that's what he was going to continue to do. And I wasn't around for all of the agita and all of the, and that there's a lot of that in the book. I spoke at length with his production partners, Chris Collins and Lydia Tenalia, and they have a lot of stories about Tony just really kind of melting down, or really having, series of existential crises about what it meant to be a television star. But I think it also, it really dovetailed with the fact that being a television star meant he was burning down his entire life and starting over. And that's a scary endeavor, as beautiful as it was, as intoxicating as it was. And, he knew the brass ring only came around once, and he was going to grab it no matter what. But it came at a much higher cost than I realized when he was alive.
Any other questions? Tell us about your podcast, briefly.
It's a silly podcast. My podcast partner, Chris, and I, lately we've been watching old episodes of Julia Child's the French chef cooking show and recapping them. We talk about, food media feuds. We talk about things we've been cooking. We have guests on who have written books. It's fun. It's, when I told Tony I wanted to start a podcast, I just thought, it was just a conversation. And he said, great, how can I get involved? I'd like to help, And I thought, don't you have enough to do? He was like an extremely busy guy. He insisted that he said, I'm going to lend you my name. I'll be your executive producer. I'll come on. You can interview me. You're going to get 1 billion downloads. You're going to make so much money. He said, do you know how much money Joe Rogan makes as a podcaster? And I thought, yeah, but not exactly Joe Rogan. So we have yet to, turn a profit on it, but it's a lot of fun, and it's just a way to kind of blow off steam and maybe talk a little shop about the industry.
Which, speaking of Joe Rogan, you were fantastic on it, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
It was, if
Thank
you haven't
you.
heard her on the Joe Rogan podcast, it was really...
Thank you.
So what's next, aside from continuing to build the podcast empire into the next Joe Rogan?
Yeah. Well, I'm working on a book that has nothing to do with Tony. It's called A Book About Bread, or that's the working title anyway, and it's a sourdough baking guide. I'm hoping it's the next sort of big bread book. It's with the baker Richard Hart, who is British, worked as a chef as a number of years in London and places including Gordon Ramsay's restaurants. Spent 6 years as the head baker at Tartine in San Francisco, and then went to Copenhagen and opened Hart Bakery under the auspices of the Noma Group. And he's been there for a few years making really fantastic bread. He's a funny, really great teacher, very kind and gentle person, and he makes just extraordinary bread. I had never made sourdough before we started working together, and I'm now making decent sourdough loaves. So we're writing that book, and that'll come out next year. I'm starting to do, as much public speaking as I can. I find that people are really interested in Tony. People have the kinds of questions that we talked about tonight. Tony's death was such a shock and such a hard loss for so many people that I find it's really rewarding to go out and kind of talk about the books and talk about him, tell my stories. I got to travel with him a little bit, so those are fun stories. And I'm hoping to write my own book about my own experiences. I've been in this business of restaurants and travel and food since the late 90s, and it's changed a lot, and and as you know, it's a super fun, super rewarding, and ultimately, one of the best industries to be in. So,
with that said, ladies and gentlemen, Laurie Woolever, thank you very much for joining us. And we can have continued conversation over cocktails, and she's more than happy to personalize one of the books on your way out.